My father did the 6 weeks of his dying, raging, reciting poetry, and finally pacified by morphine, in a remote 18th century windmill on the East Anglian fens. It had been built to provide wind power to help drain the land, but by the time my father and stepmother bought it, the sails and cogwheels were long gone. A previous owner had stripped out the rusting machinery, added a low nave with extra rooms and painted it a dusky pink. From a distance, and with the paint flaking off, it looked like a church washed up on the banks of a river. When the local farmer covered the black fields in every direction with plastic sheeting that miraged into floodwater in certain lights, the building always looked to me like a boat or an ark untethered from its moorings. It was so far from civilization that it did not figure on GPS systems. The undertakers took 4 hours to reach us. Since they'd moved into it 6 years earlier, my father had turned the mill into a pagan shrine, pasting its round, 6-foot-thick walls with passages from Eliot's 4 quartets and from Yeats's last poems, owl feathers and Celtic symbols. He glued the lines of poetry onto the plaster, and when the damp made the paper curl off, he'd hammer in huge nails that made the plaster crack. They'd bought the house on a whim a year after their wedding. They both wanted to live on flat land, he said. They both liked big skies. It's on the banks of a fen river, he said, when he phoned to say they'd found the perfect house. The Romans used it to ship building materials across the fens. During the war, a farmer ploughed up a hoard of Roman silver plates, covered in tritons and sea gods, just a couple of fields away, and the local Baptists used to do their baptisms here. There's a mooring platform, so we can buy a boat. But you've got no money, I muttered to myself. How exactly are you going to buy a boat? They drove me up to see it. We climbed through nettles and peered in through cobwebbed windows. It was beautiful, but it was also eerie and unsettling. All of that sky, all that black soil. American bombers crossed the land on their flight path from the Mildenhall Air Base. Falcons hung low over the riverbank or scrutinized the fields from their posts on electricity cables. 4 months later, my stepmother had turned the small circle of long-neglected riverside land into the beginnings of a garden. My father beat down the nettles with sticks. He borrowed a plough from a neighbouring farmer and broke it within a few hours. The farmer patched up the worst parts of the road. My father planted beech hedges and supervised local lads in the laying out of a lawn. He ordered and planted a grove of white birches at the far end of the garden as a birthday present for my stepmother. Their white trunks were magnificent, luminous against the black soil of the fen fields, especially at dusk. He's always had a thing for silver birches, she told me. I prefer willows. My father was built on a different scale to the rest of us. In 2007, the year of his dying, he was 68, 6'4", and 20 stone. His long, snow-white hair and beard would have made him look like an Old Testament prophet if it wasn't for the combat jacket he'd taken to wearing. He'd bought it from the Army and Navy stores to audition for the part of Mark Antony in a production of Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, and now wore it all the time. He thought of himself as an aging Antony, but to me he was Sir Andrew Aguecheek, sometimes a Falstaff, occasionally a Lear. We called him Roger in our teens and later Rog or Dodge or the big man. Never Dad. He wasn't a dad. At least not in the way that most people meant it. I'd usually just refer to him as my father. Roger seemed an absurd name for a man built on his scale. His head was twice the size of mine. When he'd had money, he'd bought his clothes from an outsized shop called High and Mighty, but now that he was poor, most of his clothes, and my stepmother's, came from charity shops. When he split the seams of his trousers, he'd staple them back together again. It was far quicker and more efficient than sewing, he insisted, when I asked what he was doing with the stapler in one hand and the washing basket in the other. My stepmother flashed me a look that meant hold your tongue. When he broke his glasses, he taped the arms back on. She flashed me a look about that, too. He had a set of dentures that had replaced some of his back teeth, and sometimes he'd take them out when he was speaking fast or reciting poetry. He'd place them on the table between us. Sometimes he'd do this in restaurants or pubs. He'd belch, too, at home and in public. His belches were loud, elongated, and reverberated like a long rumble of thunder. He belched, I think, as an act of defiance against all forms of gentility, and because it made us laugh. My brothers, and then my son, competed to imitate those sounds. It became a tribal thing.